My name is Jennifer Lemack, and I am the Chief Curator of History here at the museum. Truth be told, when we decided to host the conference here, it was to keep registration costs down. But I can't think of a better place to hold this conference than here. I hope everyone in this audience tonight realizes the vast collections and resources devoted to New York history that reside in this building. From archaeology documenting indigenous cultures 13,000 years ago, to 17th century colonial Dutch records, papers from New York families and businesses, vast Shaker holdings, and even a Fiji mermaid. So, as we are inspired by what we learned from each other tonight and tomorrow, I invite you to please use the millions and millions of documents, records, and artifacts that are located in this building for your research and history projects. It is at the core of our mission. Before we get to the main event, I would like to thank our presenting sponsors, the Pomeroy Foundation and the Gardner Foundation, for their generous support of the conference and their consistent support of New York history in general. I would also like to thank the Archives Partnership Trust and its director, Janet Braga. The Archives Partnership Trust is the only way that we, as state agencies, could host this conference. Without the trust, we would not be here. Additionally, Janet Braga's attention to details and details and details will make this whole endeavor a success. So thank you, Janet, because she's probably outside. Now I am so pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Pedro Regalado. Dr. Regalado is an assistant professor of history at Stanford University, where he researches and teaches the history of race, immigration, planning, and capitalism in urban America. His first book, Nueva York, Making the Modern City, is a history of New York City's Latinx community during the 20th century, from the pioneers who arrived after World War I to the panoply of Latinx people who rebuilt the city in the wake of 1975 fiscal crisis. Across a range of topics, from urban renewal to the rise of Latinx bankers, U.S. military operations in Central America to drug workers who repurposed tenement buildings, Nueva York demonstrates how the democratic ideals of the city hinged, in large part, on the experience of Latinx New Yorkers. Regalado's work has been featured in the Journal of Urban History, the Boston Review, the Washington Post, Platform, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and Public Books. Before coming to Stanford, Regalado was a junior fellow of the Society of Fellows at Harvard University. Born in the Dominican Republic, he was raised in New York City's Washington Heights. And on top of all of those accomplishments, he is just a really nice guy. So I am thrilled to turn it over to him. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Jennifer, for that really wonderful introduction. It's great to be here with all of you, some familiar faces, including the great historian Rob Snyder, who might be sitting somewhere up there, who gave me the time of day when I was a graduate student, so thank you, Rob. I see some folks also have wine, so you can sit back, relax. You've eaten already, so you can enjoy a relaxing talk. Tonight, I want to touch on one element of my broader book project, Nueva York, Making the Modern City, which is an account of Latinx New York between the aftermath of the Spanish-American War of 1898 and the new millennium that really centers the community's social and economic history. And the book argues that a capacious approach to Latinx's relationship to New York's economy, one that really considers the spectrum of labor and capital, enables us for the first time to see how they were active participants at each stage of the city's transition from an industrial powerhouse to a post-industrial metropolis. And today, I'm going to offer you a glimpse into one chapter, one of 8 chapters, really on urban redevelopment and urban renewal. And I should mention that, as I do in the early parts of the book, the people that today we might call Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, I'll refer to them today as Spanish speakers because of the importance of that moniker to these folks during that period. And I'm happy to say more about that if we have time for Q&A. In any case, one of the most important themes of this history deals with urban redevelopment, which in the case of Spanish speakers had a tremendous impact and began somewhat quietly. So as you can see here, on September 10th, 1937, La Voz published a column featuring a building nestled beside the Lexington Avenue Elevated in downtown Brooklyn. Quote, "The engraving that we show today is the first building inhabited by several families of nuestra raza," roughly translates to our race, "that will be demolished to carry out the widening of Tillery and Adams Streets." La Voz was a recent addition to the city's growing cluster of Spanish-speaking newspapers. It mainly catered to Spanish speakers who were interested in international news. But on that day, it bemoaned the proposed governmental raising of this 4-story building on Adams Street in Brooklyn, where a, quote, "huge contingent of the Colonia Hispana," kind of the Hispanic colony or Spanish-speaking colony, currently resides. And Colonia is also a term that residents use for these Spanish-speaking enclaves across the city. So a colonia or a colonia hispana to refer to the broader population in New York City writ large. The newspaper highlighted that several residential houses, and especially those occupied by familias hispanas, would be demolished. And it posed the question that Spanish-speaking New Yorkers would ask time and time again over the next 3 decades. They asked, where will these familias hispanas end up? The destruction of downtown Brooklyn's Adams Street building was merely a precursor for the governmental slum clearance that loomed over New York's colonias during the 1930s. Beginning in these years, government-subsidized demolition became widespread in American cities, and it gained momentum after the Housing Act of 1949. New York was particularly exceptional in pursuing these strategies before most cities, before federal subsidies, and in fact became a model for such legislation in places across the country. It witnessed some of the most notable progressive era battles over the slum, a term that you'll become very familiar with today, and this was in the early 19th century. And by the 1940s, local politicians, planners, housing administrators, labor unions, and social reformers wielded unprecedented legal powers and federal money to entrench a political culture that favored physical solutions to social problems, from substandard housing to crime to dwindling tax receipts that they believed threatened New York City's future. The efforts resulted in this vast tapestry of parks, highways, tunnels, bridges, and hundreds of thousands of apartment units inside an immense network of uniform brick buildings that reorganized large tracts of the metropolis. Redevelopment, as these programs became known, so this is both between the 1930s and through the 1950s, upended the geography of Spanish-speaking New York. The most famous example that many of you might think of is the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts in the Upper West Side, which was really a playground for the metropolitan well-to-do in the early 1960s. However, as I hope to show today, redevelopment as a persistent and enduring threat cleared Spanish-speaking neighborhoods much earlier than historians have recognized, unfolded across multiple phases between the 1930s and early 1960s, and it was especially disastrous in the interwar colonias that were essentially the nucleus, the earliest Spanish-speaking neighborhoods in 20th century New York. And the outcome, as we'll also learn, was a double blow. Redevelopment sliced through the densest concentrations of Spanish-speaking life in the city, and its underlying logic tied the presence of Spanish speakers to the slum and to the moral deviance that became associated with the slum. So today I want to walk us through that history, exploring the power of the slum as a concept that became tied to Spanish speakers. So bear with me as I offer you a little bit of planning history of social sciences. Then to the destruction of these early communities, which was really premised on slum ideology. And then the evolution of the program, which shifted a bit and a little bit more on its legacy. That's a bit more gray than we might like to think. So what you'll learn today is a mix of planning, immigration, and social history, as well as the history of particular neighborhoods. So let's turn back for a moment and recognize that these small colonias that Spanish speakers developed became fastened to the specter of the slum during the 1930s, at the same time that they were developing, and at the same time that an emerging class of researchers and city planners hoped that government-funded slum clearance would usher New York City into this modern era. A Victorian and later a progressive era holdover, the slum persisted in Lexer's planner's lexicon throughout these years, though it took on a much more technical classification, one associated with age, obsolescence, and proximity to industry. But even so, what I argue is that the concept proved resilient as a potent subtext for moral contagion. So let's take, for example, in 1936, this study by Harvard sociologist James Ford called Slums and Housing, which reinforced the era's technical classification, again, around age, obsolescence, proximity to industry, before falling into the morality ruse himself. In the same breath that he criticized the Regional Planning Authority, which emerged in the 1920s as one of the most important forces for planning in New York City and across the country, he criticized them for, quote, emphasizing factors social rather than physical in defining these blighted areas. He was the chairman of Herbert Hoover's Home Building and Home Ownership Committee, so he's a really powerful figure. But he also emphasized the built environment's potential to menace not only health, safety, and welfare, but also, in his words, morality. Right? So the outcome was the same, even if the causes of the slum were different. There was still this focus on moral contagion and deviance. For Spanish speakers who struggled to secure decent abodes in New York City in the 1920s and 1930s, the technical elements of slum housing were really a harsh reality. So residents of Brooklyn and East Harlem frequently griped that they lived without reliable heat or hot water. Conditions were especially bad in Brooklyn, where tenants complained that they did not have baths or private toilets. And at the root of the issue was a process wherein landlord prejudice against Spanish speakers in certain neighborhoods created a rental market in which owners in other neighborhoods could charge greater rents for apartments of inferior quality. Right? So very much a Jim Crow tax of sorts. Bernardo Vega, the famous Puerto Rican writer and activist, learned this not long after arriving in New York City in 1916 on a steamship that lasted 5 days. He was strolling around 89th Street with his buddy Flor Baerga when he noticed a sign that read, quote, apartment to let, so for rent, no Cubans, Puerto Ricans, or dogs allowed. Outraged, Vega and Baerga marshaled the power of the legendary tobacco workers, tabaqueros, as they call themselves. They tore down the sign and they broke a few windows. Back in East Harlem, Vega observed that rents were doubled for Puerto Ricans. He stated, quote, the landlords up in Harlem were making good money by charging Puerto Ricans high rents. I remember a building on 113th Street off Fifth Avenue where, back when Jews were still living there, apartments were renting for only $17. When the Puerto Ricans moved in, the rents went up to $35. So what was really obvious to Vega, which was landlord prejudice and greed amid extremely high vacancy rates, low vacancy rates, in the 1910s, was hardly the focus of everyday New Yorkers. Along with African Americans, many blamed Puerto Ricans as the cause for dilapidated housing. Puerto Ricans' huddled presence in city apartments, they believed, overcrowded New York's housing and diminished property values. On the one hand, this was an incomplete understanding of the structural forces that were shaping the rental market in New York City. On the other hand, they also stem from the notion that Puerto Ricans came from an overcrowded island, a theory that U.S. journalists, politicians, and settlement house leaders had echoed time and time again as impeding Puerto Rico's own industrial development. So this is something that they believed Puerto Ricans brought with them. 20 years after Vega arrived, the Rudolph Reimer, the district commissioner of immigration at Ellis Island in 1937, believed that they were causing in the city a slum condition that necessitated swift action. So here we see the work of different actors, right? So immigration officials, planning leaders, and we'll see some more as we go forward. Recurring depictions of their community as slum dwellers were not lost on many Puerto Ricans who typically took to the press, the Spanish language press at least, to fight for their dignity and also to call for, to assert their rights to aid and public services amid the Great Depression. Yet far less apparent than the insults on the street, as Vega and Baerga experienced, or in the city's newspapers, as was the case with Reimer, was the work of this emerging core of researchers who reinforced the association between slums and Spanish speakers behind the veil of academic inquiry. This wasn't something that was many people were engaging with on the day-to-day. In the 1920s and 1930s, we see the influential rise of social science studies focused on housing, health, and crime. And this phenomenon was apparent in the influence of individuals like James Ford, who worked with President Hoover, and also the Regional Planning Authority, which exerted tremendous influence on public policy. It also included the career of Harry Manuel Schulman, who eventually served as the first Deputy Commissioner of Corrections in New York City under Mayor Wagner in the 1950s. Schulman had really cut his teeth investigating the everyday rhythms of the slum. In 1938, his book, The Slums of New York, the young criminologist focused on everyday life in various poor but not yet slum areas, including Palm Street, which was a pseudonym for a thoroughfare in East Harlem, which was the most populous Spanish-speaking and Puerto Rican neighborhood. He walked the reader through its evolution, and I think it's worth focusing a little bit on the kind of language that he uses. In 1926, the block was almost solidly Jewish. In 1931, it was almost entirely Puerto Rican and Negro. With the change in population came physical deterioration in housing and the first steps in transition from residential area to a slum. This was a really powerful, albeit simple sleight of hand. Right? Schulman offered his audience a tautology that obscured any grounds for physical deterioration other than the shift toward Puerto Ricans, particularly those of inferior social and economic status, in his words, and Black Americans, as well as what the typical reader believed accompanied their presence. Right? So despite his seemingly technical classification on the slum cycle, this process of social degeneration, as he called it, Schulman, like Ford, was not so far removed from his 19th century and early 20th century predecessors, who were really focused on the question of morality. And in another, if the talk was longer, maybe I'd start with a little bit of Jacob Riis to give you that sense, but here we are. The sociologists perceived the slum as not merely a mass of deteriorating housing, but, quote, as a cultural pattern consisting of a way of living and thinking that resulted in antisocial behavior belonging principally to Black American and Spanish-speaking New Yorkers. When it came to facilitating government-funded redevelopment based on these ideas, few studies played a more pivotal role than the slum and crime, which was commissioned by the New York Housing Authority that was established in 1934, the same year as the study, by the New York State Legislature. The slum and crime emerged from a collaboration between many city agencies and employed hundreds of survey workers to work on the project. And the objective was to justify the destruction of archaic dwellings that had been slated for demolition. To achieve this, the studies, let me go back for a second. The studies authors designated certain sections of New York slums, asserting that these areas had a greater rate of criminal offenses than other areas in the city. So now we start to see the conflation not only with overpopulation, but also with crime and deviance. The results were not as conclusive as they would have liked, for they found that some of the densest concentrations of persons arrested in New York resided outside of these areas. This led to a somewhat muddled conclusion, which was slums do not cause crime per se, but wherever physical deterioration characterizes the area, delinquency rates are invariably high. So NYCHA's pursuit of wide-scale slum clearance was made possible when Congress passed the Housing Act of 1937, which established the framework for a federal subsidy program. Right? The law sponsored local clearance and enabled the vast construction of low-rent public housing that would be owned, initiated, and operated by public agencies like NYCHA. There were clearance initiatives that occurred earlier, but the 1937 Act really ushered in this new era in Gotham's physical transformation, providing funding and power for organizations like NYCHA. In the law's inaugural year alone, approximately 37,000 old law units were destroyed. That's as many as had been destroyed since World War I. So over the course of 1 year, in just 1 year, more units were destroyed than over the course of 20 years. The widening of Adams Street in downtown Brooklyn that La Voz lamented in 1937 was thus modest compared to what came next. So if we look at this map, and I'll explain these dots in a second, the nearby state-funded Fort Greene houses in the bottom were the largest public housing projects in the country, together with the Farragut houses completed 8 years later, a bit north. the project was crowned by the Civic Center to the west, which is this large area in the middle, and also by the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway to the north, which you see up to the left wrapping around it. Construction of the Civic Center, which included a cluster of government and institutional buildings, broke ground in the 1940s, and it culminated with Cadman Park Plaza, all the way on the left there, in the 1960s, so over the course of 2 decades. Meanwhile, construction of the BQE, a prelude to Robert Moses's Cross Bronx Expressway, commenced in 1937 and was completed in the 1960s. This really costly 36-mile route through Brooklyn and Queens curved along the borough's East River waterfront, its exit routes lacing through what had been densely populated neighborhoods. While many attribute the traumas of slum clearance to the machinations of somebody like Robert Moses, the palimpsest of strategies and ideas for the redevelopment of downtown Brooklyn suggests that redevelopment was a key objective of many power brokers, aiming to leverage public finance to advance their agendas. Yet regardless of their intentions and the way they wanted to go about it, those expropriating land consistently deployed the language of the slum, imbued with its racial presuppositions as a purported means of achieving social progress. This approach blinded them to the reality of daily life unfolding in the borough, where the sense of place that early migrants had struggled to cultivate since World War I really materialized. So as a way of explaining the dots here, let's turn finally to some actual people. These are the Colon brothers. On the left is Joaquin Colon. On the right is Jesus Colon. Jesus Colon might be familiar to some of you. He's father of Nuyorican literature, extremely famous figure in Latinx New York. The brothers came when they were really young. Jesus, on the right, was 18 years old. Joaquin came a little bit earlier on a steamship, the SS Guamo, lasting, again, 5 days. Jesus Colon was a stowaway. He hid in a closet to get to New York City. And Joaquin's role was to establish himself. He was around 19, 20 years old before sending for Jesus, before sending for his sister, and eventually sending for his parents. Not long after arriving on the SS Guamo in 1917, which was eventually sunk, Joaquin Colon crossed the Brooklyn Bridge after a really disappointing day in Manhattan. He was rejected from jobs he believed might stabilize his rocky journey, and he sat on a wooden bench on the Great Bridge, and he marveled at the vista before him. The river he had recently crossed, amid the Great War, worried that the ship was going to get sunk by German torpedoes, and also the Colonia in Brooklyn, where he would soon nurture belonging. At the beginning of the decade, in 1910, the number of Puerto Ricans in New York City counted roughly 554. That's barely enough to fill a high school auditorium. And in Brooklyn, Joaquin witnessed that community flourish. He was central to it, developing newspapers, organizations, only to see it dismantled under the weight of redevelopment. So to his left, the Brooklyn Bridge is on the left there, the Manhattan Bridge is on the right. If Joaquin was sitting on that bench, to his left, he'd see the Sand Street district, one of the earliest clusters of Spanish-speaking life in the borough. It catered to sailors with rooming houses, saloons, gambling dens, and tattoo parlors. One woman, Carmen Arroyo, in an oral history from the 1920s, says that it was a famous street, and if you mentioned it to people, quote, they would laugh. Sophie Negron arrived 2 years after her in 1925. Again, this is one of the few hundred people, Puerto Rican people in the neighborhood. And she lived on Sand Street, and she said that she shopped at a French and Italian grocery store before Pedro Paradiso purchased it. As you can see here, Paradiso, if you can translate, boasted some of the best coffee from Puerto Rico, and so part of the project tries to think about what do these places mean to them. As the historian Natalia Molina says, they're kind of community anchors that serve many purposes. I don't have time to go into that kind of conceptualization now, but they were really important places for these folks. It's uncertain if Arroyo, Negron, or Paradiso were the type of tenants that the Sand Street Board of Trade hoped to replace with better tenants when they cleared the area. Spanish speakers there numbered relatively few among the group of Greek, Russian, Italian, and Polish immigrants in the neighborhood. But what we do know is that government bulldozers soon widened Sand Street to make way for traffic entering the BQE, while neighboring roads, including Tenement, Prospect, and Charles, were erased altogether to develop the Farragut houses pictured here. From his vantage point on the Brooklyn Bridge, Joaquin would have also recognized downtown Brooklyn, that area right in the middle, where his peers established the first Spanish-speaking social, political, and mutual aid organizations. These included the De Hostos Democratic Club, which really was the first Puerto Rican foray into actual politics in the city, electoral politics. La Junta Nacionalista, which was focused on granting Puerto Rico independence, and La Sociedad Cubana de Brooklyn, a Cuban group. So you had many different Spanish-speaking groups in this area. These purple dots that you see here are the organizations. The orange dots are the businesses, and this is one small sample of a much broader project that my team is working on. So we've mapped every business and Spanish-speaking business in New York in 1934. We've got over 1,500. The maps look remarkable. You'll be able to click through them, see the businesses, the owner, etc. We also have it for 1964 to see the change over time across dealing with the matter of redevelopment as well, to see which places were dislocated, where did they go, how did it continue to grow. And by 1964, we've got over 5,000 businesses that we've been able to map already. Really incredible. Many of the organizations that you see here initially gathered in homes and storefronts before developing their own, renting their own buildings and spaces, and they played a vital role in facilitating both diasporic and New York-based politics. They formed the backbone of interwar Spanish-speaking New York, especially in Brooklyn. After the dust settled, each of these places was cleared to make way for the Civic Center. Redevelopment's onslaught continued southwest along the BQE toward Columbia Street, where Joaquin and his brother had disembarked off of the bridge. Many folks didn't leave far from the docks in case they had to go back. And so for this reason, you have these dense clusters by the waterfront. There, a mile-long trench along Hicks Street from Hamilton to Atlantic Avenue tore through the neighborhood, taking with it 168 Sackett, where members of the community had formed the Betances Democratic Club after the killing of 2 young Puerto Ricans in 1928. Parallel to Columbia Street now ran a highway that enabled motorists to steer through the city and into budding suburban tracts in Long Island, Westchester County, and beyond with ease. In the eyes of administrators like Robert Moses, the transportation achievement had ushered New York City into a modern era of transportation. Interwar Spanish speakers, on the other hand, experienced it as a loss. Thinking back on the moment when he stood up from that Brooklyn bench, he went into downtown Brooklyn, into Fulton Street, which was really the crossroads of La Colonia Hispana. Colon grieved, quote, all of that has disappeared. The state-sanctioned destruction of areas where Spanish-speaking life unfolded dealt a devastating blow to the sense of belonging that Spanish speakers had cultivated in New York City and in Brooklyn, beginning in World War I and a little bit earlier. In the process, what I argue is that slum clearance marked a crucial turning point, that while the community, the kinds of conflicts that the community became embroiled in the 1920s involved Spanish speakers and their neighbors, as was the case with the murder of 2 young Puerto Ricans or the riot in East Harlem between shopkeepers in 1926, those of the following decade, of the 1930s and beyond, increasingly involved state power in the form of redevelopment. So it wasn't just this interpersonal, interethnic conflict as much as it was one with the state and the power of the state as well. Importantly, this was not a clean break from what came before. Instead, planners and administrators drew upon the way Spanish speakers, especially Puerto Ricans, had been perceived by immigration officials like Rudolph Reimer, who argued that they posed a threat to the city's future, landlords and tenants who believed Spanish speakers brought with them unsanitary living conditions, researchers who incorporated them into their pseudo-slum logic, pseudo-scientifical, pseudo-technical slum logic, and federal assessors of the Homeowners Loans Corporation, the HOLC, which we now know as pioneering redlining, who perceived their presence as a, quote, infiltration, and you see this in many of the documents. Essentially, these instances affirmed local government's racialization of Spanish speakers as detrimental to New York's social and material fabric. This narrative, in turn, facilitated the destruction of places that these New Yorkers of various stripes, again, housing officials, police, social reformers, politicians, never really understood. I should mention that there was some pushback from many Spanish speakers, particularly to the Red Hook houses that were completed in the late 1930s. But really, these early efforts at resisting, unlike what we'll see in a moment in the 1950s and 1960s, were really no match for the political machinery that made New York City a bellwether of urban redevelopment across the country, actually. What's really important to note is also that Brooklyn's transformation in the 1930s did not dislodge the prevalence of overcrowding and dilapidated housing that planners hoped to erase by creating these plans. Rather, in pockets of concentrated poverty where Puerto Ricans lived, landlords continued to maximize profits by subdividing units and still generating, while still charging higher rents. To give you an example of that, there's a mid-century study, so 1950, that revealed that 4 houses near downtown Brooklyn, built in 1899 for single-family residency, had been converted into 65 apartments containing 91 adults and 158 children, all of them were Puerto Rican. Only 8 had private toilets. 4 had showers, private showers, and on average, tenants paid $56 per room compared to the median in Brooklyn in 1950, which was $41. So they paid $56, the average was $41. Meanwhile, monthly proceeds to the landlord came in at $4,400 a month. Just for reference, that's 33% more than the average yearly income for an American family in 1950. So really, they were making a killing, again, by subdividing these units in this moment. This kind of profiteering unfolded at a much broader scale across the East River and North and East Harlem. This is the other Spanish-speaking enclave in the city in this moment. Manhattan was home to 139,000 Puerto Ricans. In 1950, they composed over 50% of the entire Puerto Rican population in the city, so they're really clustered in this place. During the early stages of urban redevelopment, the landlord predation that Bernardo Vega had noticed in 1916 had only accelerated. And by the 1950s, redevelopment in East Harlem functioned in a way akin to racist landlords contracting the rental market for Black Americans and Spanish speakers and making it easier for the most pernicious landlords to take advantage of them, to essentially harvest desperate tenants. 2 post-war developments, I argue, continued to facilitate this dynamic. The first was that New York doubled down on slum clearance with the Housing Act of 1949. This was a response to a national housing shortage, and it conferred upon local leaders the power and resources to overhaul neighborhoods across the country at a vast, vast scale. The provisions for private developers, in the words of the Housing and Home Finance Agency, offered an unprecedented opportunity for a joint attack on the social and economic evils of the slum by communities and the federal government with active participation of private enterprise. So we see the evil here as a kind of language that continues to be prominent in the way that people think about redevelopment and why it's important. In the 10 years following the act, New York was awarded $34 million, more than any other city in the country. And by 1959, there were 13 urban renewal projects underway that cleared over 200 acres of city land in every borough except Staten Island. Staten Island, in both directions, does not get much love in this work. The second pivotal development was the reaction of local news media, housing administrators, and journalists to the vast migration of Puerto Ricans during the post-war period, particularly between 1940 and 1960. During that 20-year period, 600,000 Puerto Ricans arrived in the city. In 1940, there were 61,000. Those were all the folks that we had been talking about up to this moment. They had gone from 500 to 61,000 over the course of 30 years. And over the course of 20 years after that, grew by 600,000. And this solidified in many journalists, planners, politicians, the link that had been developed earlier between slums and Spanish speakers and Puerto Ricans in particular. So if they were perceived unfavorably then in the 1930s, they were now considered a full-blown problem to the city's housing, welfare, and law and order apparatus. In East Harlem, home to the densest concentration of public housing in the country and the densest concentration of Puerto Ricans, the confluence of these two forces, the 1949 Housing Act and the way that Puerto Ricans were perceived, contributed to the unparalleled disruption and displacement of Puerto Rican and Spanish-speaking communities. These projects included the Johnson, Foster, Jefferson, and Taft houses, which together formed a mile-long stretch from First Avenue, which would be like right where this wall is, to Lenox Avenue, from 112th Street to 115th Street. And just south of that strip, they also included the Lexington, Washington, Carver, and Clinton houses. Determining the precise number of Spanish speakers displaced is no small historical challenge, especially because up until now, the 1950 census did not, as previous censuses had, account for Puerto Ricans or those of Spanish surname in the aggregate. Nonetheless, if we consider one geographer's analysis of two of the densest housing tracts, census tracts, along with the total decline of Puerto Ricans, we can deduce that between 11,000 and 19,000 Puerto Ricans were displaced just in this lower area alone. And that's just a small sample of what happened in downtown Brooklyn, other parts of East Harlem, the Upper West Side, and the Lower East Side as well. And again, this doesn't include many of the businesses, which you see here, that reflected the sense of belonging in place that residential statistics don't really enable us to get at, right? Recall that many of the people lived in these places because there was nowhere else to go. And so the businesses also offer us, I argue, a sense of what it actually means to belong in place as well. For NYCHA residents, displaced residents were little more than collateral damage. By 1954, City's Planning Commission admitted that the volume of site clearance activity since World War II had an enforced population displacement completely unlike any previous population movement in New York City's history. They also found that less than a third of families displaced up to that point had found homes in public housing. This was partially because of the stringent requirements that NYCHA had for many residents. So there's one example of a woman writing to a Spanish-speaking newspaper saying, learning about public housing, saying, my husband's off at the war, I'm here with my daughter, can we get a home in public housing? And the answer was no, because you had to be a complete nuclear family to be admitted into these spaces. At the same time, I don't want to really depress you guys all that much. This is very much a story of endurance, evolution, and resistance. For redevelopment, slum clearance profoundly disrupted Spanish-speaking life more than it banished it from the city altogether. It mostly reorganized their presence. In downtown Brooklyn, redevelopment pushed Puerto Rican tenants away from downtown Brooklyn and the Columbia Street waterfront into neighborhoods like Bushwick, Williamsburg, Flatbush, and Sunset Park. In East Harlem, Puerto Ricans migrated to the streets and avenues adjacent to many of these developments and eventually to the Bronx. And so in many ways, this may be the origin story of the modern Spanish-speaking Latino or Latinx neighborhoods that we know today, and that really generated tremendous cultural contributions to the city and really to this country and the world beginning in the 1970s and 1980s. Moreover, as thousands of white New Yorkers took advantage of federal subsidies to relocate to nearby suburbs, public housing gradually opened to many Spanish speakers. So Puerto Rican tenants in NYCHA-operated buildings grew from 5.4% in 1953 to 28% in 1974. So over the course of 20 years, they grew to over a fifth of the population. In the process, they became key players in the preservation of public housing, and doing so through many public housing tenant associations, which we really don't know much about. Nick Jervis just wrote a really wonderful article about it a couple years ago, including the East Harlem Carver Houses Tenants Association, headed by Jorge Ramirez in the 1960s. So they increasingly made these spaces theirs and fought for what the kind of investment that they believed these kinds of buildings needed. On the other hand, Spanish-speaking participation in the city's unions, particularly the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, enabled some in the community to reap the benefits of organized labor's urban redevelopment activities. So Jewish labor unions really pioneered cooperative housing in the 1920s, and with the kind of muscle that they gained in the 1930s, they increasingly tapped into local and federal subsidies to develop housing for their members as well. During the 1950s, the Garment Workers Union was one of the formed part of the city's United Housing Federation. The UHF, which was a conglomerate of many unions, teamed up with the city and the federal government to spearhead many urban renewal projects, Title I projects as they were known. And this included the East River Houses, and also completed in 1956, and also the Penn South development in Chelsea in 1962. Like most redevelopment initiatives before it, a lot of this early work to develop these also depended on the classification of pre-existing neighborhoods as slums. And early on, union leaders like David Davinsky really embraced that kind of language. And so at the opening of the East River Houses in 1956, he stated, 53 years ago, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union was officially organized to war against the sweatshop. Now, 50 years later, the garment workers return to their place of origin. We have wiped out the sweatshop, he proclaimed. Now we return to wipe out the slum. So a pretty complicated legacy. Right? Here is the leader of the largest union in the city at the time, really kind of using the language that was used to clear many sites early on and that was quite damaging, and at the same time offering workers and union members an opportunity to tap into affordable, decent housing. Given that Puerto Ricans comprised 1/5 of the affected population, garnering their support for the project was really important. So this was really different from the late 1930s where they were completely marginal. For its part, Chelsea for Chelsea, a neighborhood organization that was kind of fighting the project, appealed to Puerto Rican residents with Spanish language flyers. On the other hand, one garment union member in the neighborhood who supported the project wrote to Dubinsky urging him to emphasize the work that the union had done on behalf of those of, quote, Spanish descent in the city, as well as in Puerto Rico. And there he's alluding to the Santiago Iglesias houses that the Garment Workers Union developed in Puerto Rico a few years earlier. He beseeched Dubinsky to, quote, send plain, ordinary members of Spanish descent to speak on behalf of the union's housing efforts. By 1959, tenants in the site received letters from the UHF, President Abraham Kazan, letting them know that the union had acquired the deed to their land. This is from an archive in Colombia of one of the settlement house leaders of the neighborhood. It's unclear how many Spanish speakers actually got positions or homes in these projects. Local 22 and Local 23, which were heavily Spanish-speaking locals in the union, were actually bondholders in the project. And so based on that, we might imagine that some of them were. We also know that prominent Spanish-speaking member, Kathy Andrade of the union, also received a home. She was a really legendary organizer and immigrant rights activist. And it sounds like we also had another member here in the crowd who lived in Penn South, so I would really, don't go anywhere. I would love to talk to you after this. But the detrimental impact on demolition was really undeniable. So one resident, Gil Torres, who had recently been displaced from Lincoln Center, from Lincoln Square, San Juan Hill, complained that the relocation office at Lincoln Square did not tell him about what was going on near the garment district, near Penn South. He said, quote, now I have to move again. He lived with his wife, who was expecting a child, and in an affidavit to the borough president, the distressed father-to-be concluded with a very straightforward statement of fact. Quote, I do not have money to pay more rent. The Penn South Cooperative was dedicated in May 1962. Here's a photograph of it with Wagner there, and some of the folks in the front include President John F. Kennedy, Nelson Rockefeller, the state governor, and Eleanor Roosevelt. And in the end, it cleared approximately 20 acres, tearing down 360 buildings, displacing 2,600 families, but also housed many workers. And so here we might think about some of the complicated legacies and the way that the project evolved over the course of 30 years, almost 30 years. So bringing it back to some of the lessons that I want you to take away from tonight, the first is that redevelopment, as a persisting and enduring threat, clears Spanish-speaking neighborhoods much earlier than we typically think. So if you thought it started with Lincoln Center, now you know it started actually almost 3 decades earlier. It unfolded across several phases, marked by the Housing Act of 1937 and the Housing Act of 1949, and it proved especially disastrous in 2 of the communities that really were the nucleus, the genesis of Spanish-speaking New York, downtown Brooklyn and East Harlem. Moreover, beyond slicing through the densest concentrations of Spanish speakers in New York, its underlying logic tied Spanish-speaking presence to urban degeneration as early as the 1930s. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is how it persisted long after the program's demise, the way that we think about the term the inner city, and the way we think about contagion in certain neighborhoods in New York. Yet, as the 1950s and 1960s progressed, Spanish speakers, driven by landlord exploitation and government clearance, increasingly positioned housing distribution as central to community mobilization. And their battles on both sides of their participation on both sides of the battle for New York City housing evinced their shift from enduring others' visions for what the city's future holds to shaping what revitalization could mean and whom it should serve. This was especially evident in the work of organizations of groups like radical groups like the Young Lords at Comité, also organizations like the Carver Houses Tenant Association, which I mentioned a moment ago, and also the Puerto Rican Merchants Association, which I spoke about a year ago today, and so I'm going a little bit of prehistory of that, who fought against business displacement, and in a wild turn of events, shifted from experiencing displacement, business displacement, to wielding the war on poverty, to wielding federal power in favor of their businesses. So the mid-1960s was really a watershed moment. In each case, it appeared that unlike the 1930s, as clearly evident in Chelsea's battle to have Spanish speakers advocate for or against the project, it seemed that New York's Spanish speakers were politically marginal no more. Thank you so much for your time. Should I take some questions? Yeah. I'm very happy, thank you, and I'm very happy to take any questions you have and answer them to the best of my ability. Yes?
Questions? First, I just wanted to clarify, sounds like mostly you're talking about looking at people coming to New York from the Caribbean.
Yes.
Central and West Africa.
Yeah.
Can you talk within a context of the kind of push and pull for specifically Puerto Ricans from the island to New York?
Absolutely. So in the early period, there was a particular shift after 1898 in New York's Spanish-speaking community. And so the book really centers on the 20th century in large part because the earlier communities, which were mostly Cuban, Puerto Rican, and Spaniards, and really just a few thousand, were communities that were mostly focused on anti-imperial activism against the Spanish crown. After 1898, many of those communities actually go back home, particularly Cubans. You have people who are waiters, working service jobs in the cities, going back and becoming senators, shaping the new Cuban Republic. What happens after 1898 is that many of the commercial ties between New York City in particular and Puerto Rico and Cuba grow, essentially. So one good example of that is the garment industry. So Macy's, Gimbel's, Wanamaker's, all of New York's major department stores, before it was made in China, it was made in Puerto Rico. And so that developed certain steamship routes that were quite active. And by the 1920s and 1930s, many Puerto Ricans armed with citizenship after 1917 with the Jones Act were able to move with far more ease than other like Central American or South American migrants in particular. So that's the reason for Puerto Ricans in the early period. And then after, during the 1940s and 1950s, it was a different economic program, Operation Bootstrap, which was a way of Puerto Rican leaders, with the help of new dealers like Rexford, Tugwell, and others, to try to quote-unquote modernize the island, and particularly its industry. And so a big component of that dealt with the question of population. So the Department of Labor was helping U.S. contractors, particularly in New York, but also across the Northeast, in places like Lowell and many small towns, a lot of contract work for many Puerto Ricans in that moment. So those are a couple reasons why. I see one all the way in the back. You get the question. Oh, over there as well? So I think there's three. So why don't we start 1, 2, and 3?
Okay. I'm curious, as you were speaking about the displacement that happens, particularly in the Lincoln Center, Rosberg, Moses period, it brought up for me, like, how much is this New York City damaging its own economic base, and that contributing to the city's financial crisis shortly thereafter?
Yeah, this is a really great question, one that I've grappled with for a long time. The historian Joe Schwartz has this theory called blue-collar blight, which was, that urban renewal and urban redevelopment as early as the 1930s was not just concerned with clearing old housing, but also industry, because proximity to industry was seen as detrimental to property values. This was especially the case with Stuyvesant Town. When Robert Moses was quoted as saying something along the lines of, like, this is the first time that I heard that redevelopment damages industry, but many, many jobs were lost. So in downtown Brooklyn in particular, what you see is that many of the industrial spaces where Puerto Ricans worked, the American Safety Razor Company, sites that employed dozens and eventually hundreds of Puerto Ricans during the 1940s were cleared, or in the case of the American Safety Razor Company, fled south because they believed that renewal and displacement was imminent. They also wanted to escape the kind of organized labor that many Puerto Ricans were participating in the Garment Workers Union and on other spaces as well. The question of the causal effect on actual industry is really unclear still. We just have anecdotal data of like all of these jobs were cleared along the East River, in downtown Brooklyn, elsewhere. But it's obvious to me that it had some impact. How much is still really unclear because many jobs were leaving as early as I mentioned a moment ago, to Puerto Rico in the 1920s and 1920s. So that cycle of globalization and capital flight, which sped up after World War II, actually began much earlier. Particularly in Puerto Rico, we might think of early Puerto Rico in the 1920s and 30s as a kind of model for the kind of industrial flight and the advantages that many industries get after that. By the 1930s, garment work was the second largest industry on the island. So whereas in 1898 it was like coffee and these other kinds of commodities, that was the base. And by the 1940s, a lot of that goes to the Philippines, to China. And so I'm unsure about the actual relationship between the two, but it's clear that it actually cleared many jobs as well. That's a great question. I think here and then.
So going back to the beginning, you had mentioned that there was an apartment to be rented, but it wasn't open to Cuban or
Yeah.
Puerto Ricans. Was that due to the fact that they were the main immigrating Spanish speakers? Was it due to the fact that they were just being used as a figurehead for all Spanish speakers in the U.S.? And then I was also wondering if you might be able to quickly mention why you use the more ambiguous term Spanish speaking as opposed to referring to them by any kind of like ethnicity.
Yeah. That's great. So to answer that first question, something that's kind of like the elephant in the room that I discuss in a different chapter is the proximity to blackness that many Spanish speakers have in this moment, which is still quite complicated. So for instance, on the one hand, studies show in the 1940s and 1950s that light-skinned Puerto Ricans had a much easier time getting housing than black Puerto Ricans or brown Puerto Ricans. And you see this also in the census. So I've looked through the census for Sunnyside, Queens, and you have one Spanish-speaking surname, and you have a bunch of German, Irish ancestry surnames, and in race you have white. So there's a particular way in which racial differentiation within the community is really, really important. But it's also the case that there's a particular anti-Spanish speaking bigotry that's emerging in these years as well, in the 1920s and 30s. There's an interview of this woman, Santos P., who was a garment worker on the island before she came to New York in the late 1920s. And she says that she migrated because her boss told her, "You're white, you have blue eyes, you'll have an easy time over there." And indeed, she did have an easier time, but she said in the interview that she would have no problem until she opened her mouth, until she was heard speaking Spanish. So in this earlier moment, there's the issue of blackness, but then there's also the issue of Spanish speakers as being seen as having particular qualities and stereotyped in a particular way, such that by the 1950s, if a Dominican in New York calls himself Spanish, it means something very different than if a white New Yorker calls him Spanish. A Dominican person calling them Spanish in the 50s is calling to the kind of solidarities of this kind of pan-Caribbean group. For a white New Yorker or a white landlord renting to a Spanish person, it evokes these ideas of overcrowding, of deviance that begin to develop in the 1920s and 1930s. So this is why I think that early period is so important. And this also relates to your second question about language, which is such a loaded and complicated one, like why Latinx, why Latino, why Hispanic. I choose Spanish speaker for this early part of the book because language was such a powerful unifying force for many of these migrants in such a polyglot city. So for many of the garment workers, what you find is in their oral histories and in their records, as I'll give you the example of Lucila Padron, who I feature in the second chapter. She was Puerto Rican, and she would advocate for Costa Ricans and for Dominicans because she could speak Spanish and she knew that the boss was cheating them out of money. So there's a particular way in which just the practical nature of being in the workplace, of knowing that there are some pre-existing ties to Hispanism, but nothing really solid. You know, Lucila Padron grew up outside of Ponce, a pretty rural place, didn't get far in like her education, but she had a sense of unity, but that was really solidified actually in the workplace. These are Spanish-speaking people, and so she's going to join the Spanish-speaking committee of Local 23, for instance, and she sees that as theirs. So in that moment, that's the case. Today, when I talk to my students, they'd call me crazy if I said that Spanish was the unifying force for Latinidad, right? So part of what the project tries to do, one of the major interventions outside of the work on urban history and on capitalism and on the way that empire shapes people's experiences in the city, is also to really think of Latinidad as a historically contingent discourse. That what it meant in the 1920s to be a Spanish speaker was somewhat similar but very different than what it means in 2024, right? And so that's why I think throughout the book it's important to kind of adapt to the kinds of terms that people are using. I think I see one here, and then I thought I saw one right here. Oh, yes. Sorry. I need more Coca-Cola.
I want to take it in a slightly different direction.
Sure.
I wonder if you're familiar with the effort to preserve the Our Lady of Guadalupe, Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe Church in Chelsea on 14th Street in Manhattan, which was the first Spanish-speaking Catholic church in the city. It has been closed by the diocese, and it's unclear what they're doing with this. And I want to connect that to a broader question of where in New York City can you find this history interpreted? Right? We have the Museo del Barrio, which is really an art museum. We have the Museum of the City of New York and other spaces that occasionally do exhibitions on this history. But where do you see potential as a public historian to do more of this interpretation? I love the documentation of all the businesses, and I just want to. The reason I'm invested in the preservation of that church is because my great-grandparents were married there in 1923, and my great-grandfather was an immigrant from Spain, from Galicia, and my great-grandmother was a migrant from Puerto Rico. Wow.
We should also talk, don't leave after that. You know, this question of religion is so important, and something that my manuscript readers pushed me to. I had a workshop a couple weeks ago, because one of the things that you see when you look through many of the urban renewal photos, as you saw actually with the one of Pensao, let's see, boom, there it is that many churches were preserved. Now you see these photos of just land cleared as if it was Dresden or something, and then there's just a church. So churches were often the spaces that were protected, in part because those were the spaces that, as is the case today, if you go somewhere like Camden, where people from old times continue to come to, right? Like they might live in Haddonfield or wherever, but they come back to that church. And I think that's a really important point. I know very little about that part, and I think that's something that I really want to learn more about. And so we'll talk a little bit more after this, hopefully, about the role of the church. The other piece about how to get this communicated, there really isn't anything for the urban redevelopment piece, which is really remarkable. Lincoln Center has put together this wonderful website where different scholars are contributing to trying to uncover the history of what was in San Juan Hill. But there's nothing for downtown Brooklyn and very little for East Harlem. And so part of what the grant that I got to develop this digital project tries to do is have that as an interactive interface with folks to be able to see what was there before. So on the one hand, you know, it's important to chart these businesses for giving folks a sense of belonging that business offers, but also to give a sense of what's destroyed, right? So when I show, let's see, there we go. This, we can begin to figure out, like, what was actually displaced. Some of these businesses moved, some didn't. There's an article by, gosh, I'm forgetting her name at this moment, in 1950. Oh, it'll come back to me. It's going to kill me. Where she's walking the reader through, it'll come to me in the morning right when I wake up. Gosh, I can't remember. But she walks the reader through old East Harlem. And she walks through the bakery of Simon Ju, who was a bakery and also a music store. This is where early salseros got many of their instruments and their pastries. I mean, there's this whole, like, world that's absolutely destroyed that was so meaningful to these folks. And even though Latinx New York only grew after this, and I think maybe that's part of the reason, is that as this is going on, just more folks are coming, right? And so this maybe obfuscates what was lost. But the hope is that that digital project will offer something. There's also something called Historias that the Clemente Center is spearheading. That'll be this 3-year project that I'm working with them to try to figure out, like, you know, academics are really good at working by ourselves and in silos. And so part of the idea is, like, how do we get these kinds of maps out there? How do we commission work by poets, artists, based on this kind of work? So try to think really creatively about that. Here.
How do I associate the clearance of the neighborhood where Lincoln Center is built now with West Side Story? Is the neighborhood where the sharks and the jets?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think the play was 1959, so the battle, 57? Oh, okay. So 57, is that right?
Part of the opening scene where they're having that fight actually is happening in the rubble of the San Juan Hill.
Yeah.
There, I've been searching through documents. This is not my dissertation.
A rabbit hole.
Yeah. I've been trying to figure out how much Leonard Bernstein actually was, as he was composing the music, if there was any connection, because he was also a huge part of the Lincoln Center board on getting it.
Oh, was he?
Right.
And he's probably walking around.
Nobody is like to find any connections behind all. How much was that actually was thinking about?
Yeah.
But yes, there's definitely connections. Sorry.
No, I mean, you answered it better than I could. All I know is that there is that, is kind of the overlap in time. Maybe we can find just that image that we began with today. I have a lot of images to keep you all awake. Here it is. But you imagine, he must have been walking around this space. He must have been extremely involved.
There was a huge opening ceremony in 1959 that he was conducting music for in that area.
Incredible.
So it's just like, how?
And it's, I mean, this is also a really good example of how things change over time. Like, this is a mecca of black jazz today, right? Like, Wynton Marsalis is playing here pretty often, and it was also a space of jazz before that, right? And so, again, and this is similar cases across the country. You think of Chavez Ravine in LA with Dodger Stadium. That's an urban renewal project, and you can see pictures of people being pulled out of there by police, right? Now you see, as Eric Avila has written beautifully in his book, Mexican-American Dodger fans in the space, and just like the reappropriation of space over time, right? That makes it that it's not only a story of victimization, but one that we might think about the role of immigration over the late 20th century and early 21st century as really transforming space across the country. I think I saw, is that answer? I think she answered it better than I did.
Yeah.
I think I see a few over here. I'm happy to take maybe the one in the middle first, and then front, and then.
So I'm familiar with the urban destruction on the Upper West Side. The 70s, I'm pretty familiar with from the end.
Yes.
I think the breakfast, friend of mine actually did it.
Oh, really?
And then its connection to the development of the movement and in the Bronx, in terms of young Lord's work and PSP and all of this, and other general skills.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Absolutely.
But how did that connect to, or what was the connection between that, which it didn't start in and of itself, but with the change that was happening in Brooklyn and then over on East Harlem? In other words, how did that experience inform that movement that began to develop, or that, again, probably didn't begin to develop, I understand it from my own personal
Yeah.
history, develop in, on the west side
Yeah.
and then into the South Bronx, Lincoln and
So like the connection between clearance sites and the way that that congealed in a particular politics that emerged in the 70s and 80s?
yes, thank you for saying that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I should write that down for the book, actually. You know, it's interesting because what you see is many different responses to this. Right? Like there's the movement of El Comité, there's the movement of homeowners association. So like Pedro Quiñones, who was displaced from the Columbia clearance one, I think it's right above Morningside Heights on Broadway. He develops this association for homeowners. So he goes from kind of battling it more as a kind of radical to saying, okay, like maybe home ownership is the key, because if you own the land, there's less of an opportunity for folks to displace you. Of course, with eminent domain, that's not the case, but there are many different strategies that are emerging in this moment. I think you're absolutely right that the Upper West Side becomes this important site, in part because of the Upper West Side urban renewal area, which never comes to fruition. It takes many, many years to happen. And that becomes a flashpoint because the person that Wagner assigns as the commissioner is Herman Badillo, a 31, 32-year-old Herman Badillo. And the response from many Puerto Ricans is to say, like, this is a moment where you see this class division. To say, like, no, Badillo's with the real estate interests. He's not one of us. The mayor thinks he's assigning a Puerto Rican and that we're just going to sign on. And so it's interesting to see, like, the late 1960s, early 70s as this moment where this more radical politics is emerging from a different generation. What's really interesting about the folks like Joaquin Colon, Jesus, and all of the oral histories that I've listened to from folks who arrived in the 20s is that they almost never talk about the experience of displacement, which is very difficult to make sense of. On the one hand, I could project the notion that these are folks that had been displaced before. They had been displaced from their small towns to cities by agricultural developments on the part of the U.S. They had moved from San Juan to New York. So they had this experience at a very young age of feeling like they're moving from place to place and feeling like maybe that's part of how they think of the world. Like it doesn't affect them in the same way, although that one article of the one person that I mentioned who's really lamenting the old neighborhood maybe says something against that. But I think it's also the case that this new generation just has a different kind of politics, right? So like even Jesus Colon, who's a radical, who's working with the Communist Party, developing the International Workers' Order, really radical individual by the 1960s and 70s. He's not the new guard, even as he's running as like trying to run for state comptroller for the Communist Party. Like not, folks, the young people aren't really paying attention to that, right? Like there's a very different politics of the 60s. So I think it's a generational thing. It's also a fact that that early generation trying to explain their sense of loss is really difficult. But it's unclear, yeah. But I really like the idea of thinking about like how do these different projects coalesce in a particular politics of these young folks in that moment, you know? Like as a coda to this early. Because again, it starts in the 30s and goes much further. Thank you. I think in the front and then in the back, and then Aman Rao.
So speaking to the theme of displacement, through these various waves of Puerto Ricans and Spanish speakers, you know, being displaced from New York City, what are some of those maps of movement from New York City, and especially for this room, where in the rest of New York State were enclaves that could have come from that displacement?
Yeah.
Because before I traveled for history, I traveled for my taste buds, and I always notice in places like Buffalo, Utica, Albany, Rochester, there's always a healthy, Caribbean, contingent.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and honestly, one of the great mysteries, not only of urban redevelopment, but also of gentrification, that sociology, like outside of the discipline of history, that sociologists, anthropologists are having a really difficult time with, like, where do people go? One of the things that we'll be able to do in 10 years, once we have the 1960 data, is really track from 1950 to 19, because most of these projects happened during the 1950s, not necessarily the 1940s, is, and maybe using AI, generative AI, to try to like scrape and figure out like, where do people go? Like names on the census, where do they go? My sense is actually that a lot of folks do go to places like Philadelphia. Puerto Ricans go to Philadelphia, smaller cities across the Northeast, Bridgeport, et cetera. But I think it's also the case that folks migrate directly to those places too, which makes it really confusing, right? So I think this maybe ties to the first question, which is about like, what are the forces bringing these folks? A lot of folks are being contracted directly in many of these small towns. And it's also the case, as Lana Barber has written about Dominicans in the 1980s and 1990s, that many folks are hearing about particular neighborhoods and cities back home. Right, so like, let me give you two quick examples. The first is Santos P, the blonde, blue-eyed migrant that I mentioned earlier. She she said that in Puerto Rico, people spoke so badly about Brooklyn. And so this is why the reason she went to East Harlem. She ended up going to Brooklyn to work because it was closer to her job for her daughter. But there was already this sense of what particular neighborhoods and places were like back home. That was in the 1920s, right? So I think by the 1980s and 1990s, what Lana Barbara shows is that folks want tranquilidad. And so they go to Lawrence, or they go to Lowell, or they go to these places. So it's very difficult to track that. I think, we're looking for a young scholar to start doing that work over the course of the next 20, 30 years. So, but that's a really important question that we just don't have the answer to. Like in aggregate, right? Like we have anecdotal evidence, but we don't have like any kind of unifying theory of like movement and mobility.
So I'm an early Americanist, so I'm completely unfamiliar with the historiography here, but looking at this photograph makes me think we are now all here sitting in essentially a big and arguably failed Lincoln Center redevelopment. Like this,
Yeah.
not quite the Lower West Side or anything. But it was built in the same period and it destroyed all kinds of neighborhoods, right? One could presumably do a similar study of Albany, right? And so I guess my question is, what is, in terms of the historiography of urban redevelopment, right? What are your observations? How does your work contribute?
Yeah, that's a great question for especially early Americanists talking the urban. One of the awesome things about doing this kind of work is that I really rely heavily on the work of urban historians who've worked on different sites in different places doing similar things. One of the most studied places that we have some of the best answers to that kind of question is New Haven, Connecticut. New York got more money than anyone else, but New Haven got more money per capita than any other city in the country, in part because Ed Logue was there, who ended up being a planner in New York City. Elizabeth Kahn wrote a great book on him recently. And what you find is that the 1920s in the US was the height of urbanism. Urbanism as defined by walkability, a lot of what I'm talking about in downtown Brooklyn, right? That sense of belonging, that attachment to the block, to space. The height of that was the 1920s. As industry declined by the 1950s, urban renewal, and this is what the literature says, it shows us in different books, is essentially that urban renewal was useful for different actors in different cities for different reasons. In places like New Haven, one of the reasons urban renewal was useful was A, as it was for any other city in the country, it was free federal money. The federal government was giving $1 billion to pay for clearing the land, essentially. So it was like, if you weren't using urban renewal funds, you were essentially leaving money on the table. For New Haven, part of the idea was we've got, by the 1950s, the rise of suburbia that began really in the 1930s, during the New Deal. By the 1950s, that grows even more. And what you have is that cities are bled dry of their tax receipts, right? Commercial and residential. And so one of the big uses of urban renewal money is to bring people back into the city. So in New Haven, you have the Oak Street connector that cut through a really dense neighborhood that was, in the 1950s, a really vibrant space that was considered slum housing, right? In the technical classification, that was never truly disentangled from the question of morality and evil. And essentially, it was a means of bringing the suburbs back into the city for consumption. And so you have a ton of parking lots, really modernist parking lots, if anyone's been to New Haven, by Paul Rudolph. So that's one reason. And in a place like Pittsburgh, it's different, right? Like it's more public-private development to try to redevelop waterfronts. And that's something that you see in many cities across the country. And so part of what the literature teaches us is, or offers us, is this kind of narrative, broad narrative, to try to understand the way in which urban renewal was useful in a lot of cities for different reasons, but the way in which the common theme was trying to tap into federal money and using the subtext of housing decay, slum ideology, and also trying to bring money back into the city. In New York, it didn't work. It didn't work in Albany, arguably, right? But those are some of the reasons. And in the city, part of what, a lot of the great urban renewal literature on New York is the work of folks like Joel Schwartz, who's really thinking like, oh no, it's not just Robert Moses, it's Columbia University, it's the Garment Workers Union, it's social reformers. Like it's this liberal coalition that gives him this power, right? You also have the work of Sam Zip, who's saying, like, actually, it's also a Cold War project, a modernist Cold War project. We have very little about these people. And so part of what I'm trying to do is think about, like, how do we take their experiences on their terms? Joaquin Colon walking through the city, walking down into downtown Brooklyn, and lamenting one of the only pieces of evidence that we have is him saying all of that disappeared. He doesn't say that in any kind of tone. I deliver it in a particular tone, because that's what I imagine. But that's all we've got, so really trying to excavate that sense of place and belonging that was lost for so many folks. Is that kind of, it's a great question. Rob, and then in the front.
There's a lot of great nuances in the history that you're sharing with us. And when I look at New York City today, what I'm struck by is the city is in a crisis due to a shortage of affordable housing. And the discussion of displacement is not about slum clearance, but about gentrification.
Yeah.
And the history of public housing and government construction of housing from the 30s to the 70s is invoked to argue that government should not ever be in the business of building affordable housing.
Yeah.
This should not happen. And all solutions must be market-based. Is there anything that you can extract from the history that you've looked at in New York and other cities that would be an argument for public funding for deliberately affordable housing?
Yeah. It's a great question, Robin, as always pushing me to think about normative judgments and claims. I think let's take Liz Cohen's argument in her new book. She wrote a book about Ed Logue, who was master planner, worked with Rockefeller, worked in Boston and New Haven in New York. One of the major arguments of her book is essentially like, whatever you think of urban renewal, we're never going to get that kind of investment in American cities again. And unfortunately, I think she's right. When you look at places that have done it right, or focusing even on places that have done it wrong, the place where we're from, like the Dyckman project, the Dyckman houses, it's a matter of upkeep, right? It's a matter of investment. Like there are I don't want to say the number in this crowd, but it's hundreds of thousands of people in public housing in New York. On the one hand, that might be read, if you don't know the conditions, as a kind of success. Like this is a city within a city. That's 3 times the size of New Haven. On the other hand, it's deeply it's experiencing deep disinvestment. Right. So the question is that of investment. My colleague at Stanford, Dustin Jenkins, really thinks smartly about this in terms of like bond financing. Like, what are the ways of actually financing some of these projects that doesn't just like deplete coffers, like tax coffers, right? And this is something that Rockefeller actually helped to pioneer early on, is with the UDF, right? The urban development group that he created, is to actually use bond financing to generate a lot of this public housing. So I think maybe that's one way to go. As you know, historians are really bad at figuring out how to fix things. I just depress folks for most of the time. But this is a really big question that I think folks are starting to go in the direction of like, okay, what are the kind of mechanisms? If we're thinking, for instance, in the idea of divest from the police, for instance, like, and I mentioned this because Dustin Jenkins wrote an article about this in The Nation. Now, what does the invest side look like? What are the kinds of modes and techniques and strategies, and particularly like financial tools that everyday people should know about, that they can push for on the part of local and state governments, essentially. Yes?
So my question has to do with how much, particularly that which happened after World War II, how much did the GI Bill of Rights get involved?
Yeah.
And the reason I state that, I asked that question, is because my husband's father was in the Army, but his job was to find housing for the soldiers when they came back. And many of them came back from Camp Shanks, which is where he was working. And he eventually went on to, because of all this experience, he became one of the early people involved with the Federal Housing Department. And it was because many of the soldiers were not going back to their hometowns.
Oh.
And President Eisenhower, before he was president, was head of Columbia University, created the educational route for many
Of the
these
GI.
GIs to go to Columbia. They settled, they had to find housing in New York City. So that some of them stayed at Shanks, but many of them also found housing. How much did that have to do
Well, I would say that the 49 Act that I mentioned a moment ago, like the major impetus was the housing shortage that the U.S. experienced directly after the war. On the one hand, some historians are starting to say, like, actually the real estate board had a really big hand in, like, passing the law for particular reasons. But it was no doubt that there was a severe housing shortage. And so when I mentioned New Haven earlier, one of the things that you have after World War II is this suburban boom. As many folks in this room know, or maybe grew up in some Levitt towns. The reason that many cities developed many of these urban renewal projects, like New Haven, was to bring the folks who were moving to those new homes, the GIs who were moving to those new homes, back to consume in the city, right? And so, you know, one of the things that undercut that was development of suburban malls, which Liz Cohen has written her second book about, Consumers Republic. But this is a major, I think, impetus behind urban renewal is to say, like, okay, there's a suburban housing boom. The issue of what housing looks like in the city for many of these soldiers, like the housing crisis remains for many of them until some of them get positions in public housing. But many of them eventually leave. Like I mentioned, in 1953, Puerto Ricans were 5%. They went up in 20 years to 28%, in large part because many of those GIs were moving to these newly built suburban homes. The Levitt brothers were building, like, I forget the exact stat, but so many homes a day, right? Like just building them in one day. And so many of the soldiers ended up moving there, and urban renewal became a means of bringing them back to the city to consume while they could, you know, go back home in 20 minutes and still enjoy that suburban lifestyle while trying to inject some money into the city. That was the view of many urban leaders, at least.
His father was involved in building many of the affordable housing, the big buildings.
Okay.
And he did several of them in Newark, New Jersey. And we were present, we were invited to see the demolition.
Really? Well, how long did many soldiers stay there? Do you know?
That part I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar to the other question about, like, where do folks go? That's another side of the coin. Like, that's one I think might be slightly easier to gather still. We need the 1960 data, but because it started earlier, we can get some of that. We can look at 1950, like how many soldiers go from the city in 1940 before the war to suburban tracts, like actually spatialize that.
Because the suburban areas weren't built yet.
Right.
They didn't come until the 50s.
Yeah.
And even the malls didn't come in until late 50s. That's when they're coming in.
Yeah.
So you've got all these people who are choosing not to go back.
And this is really a question then of, like, even just a few years, right? Like 45 to like 52 or 53, like where are folks staying in that moment? What do vacancy rates look like? And again, similar to the low vacancy rates of the 19-teens, I think the vacancy rate in like 1919 in New York was like a tiny, I forget the exact percentage. Bob Fogelson wrote about this great rent wars. But you see something similar, I think, in that period before soldiers are able to move into the suburbs as well. Maybe one more question, yeah?
I had a follow-up question to the one earlier. So,
Oh, look, I recognize you.
I've been puzzling over this question. I'm really grateful for your intervention about the periodicity of Puerto Rican culture in New York, especially this early moment in the 30s. Does that have any bearing on why you don't see a strong Young Lords coalition in Brooklyn? They're all over Manhattan. They're in the Bronx, but you don't really have like a chapter in Brooklyn in the same way. And I'm wondering if any of your research about downtown Brooklyn and maybe the generational, the way that the generations evolve in Brooklyn lend itself to why you don't see that same chapter building there.
That's a really good question. I think one way to think about it is actually there is the space to generate that kind of activism, because even though they leave downtown Brooklyn, like you think of Williamsburg and Bushwick in the 1960s and 1970s. Like if I were to show, I have a map in the book that shows like not necessarily where people go, but like kind of the density of Puerto Ricans in 1960 versus 1950 in particular places. And Williamsburg, Bushwick, all those spaces are heavy sites. So it's unclear to me exactly, right? And it's unclear to me exactly actually how many Young Lords there actually were. I wonder if that's in Johanna's book at all.
It's not, so I was like, oh, maybe this is the key.
But the number, one of the things that I mentioned, I teach a Latinx history class, and one of the things that I mentioned is the Young Lords are so damn important to Latinx history in New York. At the same time, they have kind of, it's a short period, And I think part of the reason why they have this prominence is because we don't know about a lot of the other stuff that went on, like what you mentioned a moment ago, El Comité, different things that are going on in the city. I think there's a young generation of Latinx New Yorkers, which you know, that are really trying to excavate this and really pay tribute to it, like Doñitas in Williamsburg and Brooklyn, to say, like, actually, we might not have that particular history of activism around the young lords, but there are other things going on. El Puente in Brooklyn, and also many of these sites, these businesses and spaces that people see as almost like sacred sites. But the question of, like, why not Brooklyn is really interesting, because you have it in Camden, you have it in Philadelphia, you have all of these chapters, but not necessarily in Brooklyn, unclear, you know?